She was just 11 years old when she found the cabin that had been waiting in those mountains for 37 years, untouched, unlocked, and filled with a secret so profound it would crack open the silence of an entire town and prove that some things are never truly abandoned, only forgotten by those too afraid to remember. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash that subscribe button because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The mountain air in Pine Ridge, Colorado carried the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones and stayed there long after you came inside. It was the first week of October in 2023, and the aspens had already started their slow burn into gold. 11-year-old Maya Chen lived with her mother in a trailer park on the eastern edge of town, where the road turned from asphalt to gravel and the houses gave way to wilderness. Their double-wide sat at the very end of the row, its aluminum siding dented and streaked with rust, the wooden steps sagging under years of mountain weather and deferred dreams. Maya's mother, Sarah, worked double shifts at the truck stop diner 15 miles down the highway. She left before sunrise and came home long after dark, smelling like coffee and fryer grease, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been running on empty for so long she'd forgotten what full felt like. Sarah was only 32, but the lines around her mouth and the grey threading through her dark hair made her look older. She moved through life with the quiet desperation of someone who knew the rent was always 2 weeks away from being late and the electricity always one forgotten payment from being cut off. Maya understood, even at 11, that her mother was doing the best she could. She never complained about the hand-me-down clothes from the church donation box, or the fact that dinner was usually ramen noodles with a fried egg on top if they were lucky. She kept her head down at school, did her homework at the cracked formica table in the kitchen, and tried not to ask for things they couldn't afford. But what Maya couldn't quite hide, no matter how hard she tried, was the loneliness that followed her like a shadow. She had no siblings. Her father had left when she was 3, vanished into the kind of absence that doesn't leave forwarding addresses or birthday cards. The kids at Pine Ridge Elementary treated her like she was invisible, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the casual indifference that children show to those who don't fit into the established social order. She wore the wrong clothes, carried the wrong backpack, and lived in the wrong part of town. So Maya learned to disappear. She became a ghost in her own life, slipping through hallways unnoticed, eating lunch alone under the scraggly pine tree behind the cafeteria, and finding solace in the one place that never judged her: the mountains. The San Isabel National Forest pressed against Pine Ridge like a living thing, dense and ancient and full of secrets. While other kids spent their afternoons at friends' houses or at the rec center, Maya walked into the wilderness. At first, she stayed close to the well-marked trails, the ones where hikers and mountain bikers passed with their expensive gear and friendly waves. But gradually, as the months turned into years, she ventured deeper. She learned to read the mountain the way other kids learned to read social cues, where the deer bedded down at night, which streams ran year-round, how to tell a game trail from a hiking path, where the old logging roads disappeared into overgrowth. The mountains never asked her why she was alone. They never whispered about her second-hand shoes or the fact that her lunch was usually a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a paper towel because they couldn't afford plastic bags. In the mountains, Maya could breathe. She could think. She could be something other than the poor kid from the trailer park. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. School had let out early for teacher conferences, and Sarah wouldn't be home until past midnight. Maya had grabbed her worn backpack, stuffed in a water bottle and the last of the granola bars from the cupboard, and headed for the trailhead at the end of Old Summit Road. The October sky was the kind of blue that only exists at high altitude, sharp and clean and infinite. The temperature was dropping as the sun began its early descent, but Maya had learned to dress in layers, a thermal shirt under a flannel under a puffy jacket she'd found at the Goodwill 2 winters ago. She started on the Cascade Trail, a moderate 3-mile loop that most locals knew by heart. But after about a mile, where the trail forked near a cluster of standing dead pines, Maya veered left onto a narrow path she'd discovered a few months earlier. It wasn't on any map. It didn't have a name. It was just a thin ribbon of disturbed earth winding upward through dense forest, probably made by elk or deer over decades of migration. She followed it higher, her breath coming in visible puffs, her legs burning pleasantly with exertion. The forest closed in around her, thick with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The air smelled like resin and earth. Somewhere above, a Clark's nutcracker called out, its harsh cry echoing through the canopy. Maya climbed for nearly an hour, pushing past places she'd been before, driven by something she couldn't name. Not curiosity exactly. More like instinct. Like the mountain was pulling her forward. The game trail eventually intersected with what looked like an old logging road, long abandoned. Wildflowers had reclaimed the center, and young aspens grew in clumps where sunlight managed to break through. Maya paused, catching her breath, and looked around. She'd never been this far up before. The town of Pine Ridge was somewhere far below, hidden by ridgelines and tree cover. Up here, there was only wilderness and silence. She was about to turn back when she saw it, a break in the tree line about 50 yards ahead, where the forest seemed to open into a small clearing. Something about the geometry of it felt wrong, too deliberate, too square. Natural clearings were round or irregular. This one had corners. Maya's heart began to beat faster. She approached slowly, stepping carefully over fallen logs and pushing aside low-hanging branches, and then she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. There, set back against a wall of granite and surrounded by towering pines, stood a cabin. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, built from weathered logs that had turned the color of old silver. The roof was corrugated metal, rusted at the edges, but still intact. A small covered porch stretched across the front, and 2 windows flanked a solid wooden door. The whole structure looked like it had grown from the mountain itself. Like it had been there so long the forest had simply accepted it as part of the landscape. But what struck Maya most wasn't the cabin itself. It was how well preserved it looked. This wasn't a ruin. This wasn't a collapsed shell of rotting wood and broken glass. The windows were intact. The door hung straight on its hinges. The porch didn't sag. It looked like someone could walk up those 3 wooden steps right now and turn the handle and walk inside. Maya stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, her pulse hammering in her ears. She looked around, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees, but there was nothing, just the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of a raven. She took 1 step forward, then another. The clearing was overgrown with wild grasses and fireweed gone to seed, but she could make out the remnants of a path leading to the porch. Her feet followed it almost automatically, carrying her closer even as her mind screamed at her to turn around, to run, to leave this place alone. But she couldn't. It was like the cabin had a gravity all its own. When she reached the porch, she stopped again. The wooden steps looked solid enough. She tested the first one with her weight. It held. She climbed slowly, each step creaking softly under her shoes. On the porch, she could see more details. A rusted metal chair tipped on its side in the corner, a faded mat in front of the door that might have once said, "Welcome." And next to the doorframe, a small shelf with a tin can that had long since filled with rainwater and debris. Maya reached out and touched the door. The wood was cold, smooth, aged by decades of weather. There was no lock, just a simple latch. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. The latch clicked open. The door swung inward with a low groan. And Maya stepped inside. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the 2 front windows and whatever filtered through gaps in the curtains. The air smelled like dust and old wood and something else, something faintly sweet, like dried herbs or aged paper. As Maya's eyes adjusted, she could make out the shape of the space. 1 large room with a small kitchen area along the back wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs near the window, and along the far wall, a narrow bed covered with a faded quilt. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but beneath that dust, the room was remarkably intact. There were dishes stacked neatly in an open cabinet. Books lined a rough-hewn shelf above the table. Curtains hung in the windows, their fabric sun-bleached but not rotted. A kerosene lamp sat in the center of the table, and on the wall above the bed, a black and white photograph hung in a simple wooden frame. Maya walked toward it slowly, her footsteps barely audible on the plank floor. The photograph showed a woman, young, maybe in her 30s, standing in front of this very cabin. She wore practical clothes, jeans, a work shirt, boots. Her hair was pulled back and she was smiling, one hand resting on the porch railing. Behind her, the forest looked just as dense as it did now. The photo had that slightly blurred quality of pictures taken in the 1970s or early 80s. Maya stared at the woman's face. There was something about her expression, something open and hopeful, that made Maya's chest ache. She turned away from the photograph and surveyed the rest of the room. On the table, beneath the dust, she could see papers. She moved closer and gently brushed the surface clean with her sleeve. There were envelopes, unopened, addressed to someone named Elizabeth Brennan, care of Pine Ridge, Colorado. The postmarks were dated July 1986. That was 37 years ago. Maya picked up one of the letters carefully. The envelope was yellowed, but still sealed. She set it down and looked around more carefully. There was a journal on the bookshelf, its leather cover cracked with age. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, a dark ring of residue still visible at the bottom. A jacket hung on a peg by the door, its fabric stiff with time. It was as if someone had simply walked away in the middle of an ordinary day and never came back. Maya's mind raced with questions. Who was Elizabeth Brennan? Why had she left this place? Why had no one come to claim it? The cabin was remote, yes, but not impossible to find. Surely someone in town knew it existed. Surely someone had been looking for it. She walked to the kitchen area and opened one of the cabinets. Inside were canned goods, their labels faded but still readable. Soup, beans, peaches. She checked the dates. 1985, 1986. All of them decades past expiration but perfectly preserved in the cold, dry mountain air. A shiver ran down Maya's spine. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. This was a time capsule. This was someone's entire life, frozen in place and waiting. She moved to the bed and sat down gently. The quilt was handmade, its pattern a complex star design in faded blues and greens. She ran her fingers over the stitching, imagining the hours of work that had gone into it. On the small nightstand next to the bed, there was a water glass, a book turned face down to mark a page, and a pair of reading glasses. Maya picked up the book carefully. It was a paperback mystery novel, yellowed and brittle. The bookmark was a pressed wildflower, its color long since faded to brown. She set the book down and looked at the reading glasses. They were simple, wire-rimmed, and when she held them up to the light, she could see the prescription was strong. Everything in this cabin told the story of a real person who had lived here, who had read books and cooked meals and made quilts and received letters. A person who had left and never returned. Maya stood and walked to the bookshelf. She scanned the titles: Field Guides to Colorado, Flora and Fauna, novels from the 1970s and 80s, a collection of poetry, books on carpentry and wilderness survival. And there, on the top shelf, almost hidden behind the other books, was the journal she'd noticed earlier. She pulled it down carefully and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, slightly slanted to the right. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1983. Moved into the cabin today. After everything that happened in town, I needed a place where no one could find me, where no one could ask questions I don't have the strength to answer. Up here, I can breathe. Up here, I can start to forget. Maya's hands trembled as she turned the page. The entries continued, sporadic at first, then more regular. They were personal, raw, filled with observations about the forest, reflections on solitude, and scattered references to something that had happened before, something that had driven Elizabeth to this isolated place. Maya read entry after entry, her heart pounding. Elizabeth wrote about building furniture, about learning to survive the harsh mountain winters, about the peace she found in isolation. But threaded through all of it was a sadness, a sense of being haunted by something she couldn't escape. One entry from November 19th, 84 read, "Saw smoke from the town today when I hiked to the ridge. Wondered if anyone down there remembers me. Wondered if they still believe the lies. Some days I want to go back and tell them the truth. Other days I'm grateful to be forgotten." Maya closed the journal, her mind spinning. Elizabeth had been hiding from something, or someone, and whatever it was, it had been serious enough to drive her into complete isolation for years. She looked around the cabin again, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a refuge, a sanctuary. And for some reason, Elizabeth had left it all behind. The light coming through the windows had shifted, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. Maya realized with a start that she'd been in the cabin for over an hour. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours yet, but she needed to get back before dark. The mountain was no place to be caught after sunset, especially this far from any trail. She carefully returned the journal to its place on the shelf, making sure everything was exactly as she'd found it. As she moved toward the door, her eye caught something she'd missed before. A small wooden box on the kitchen counter, partially hidden behind the coffee mug. It was about the size of a shoebox, made from polished pine with simple brass hinges. Maya hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside were papers, neatly organized and tied with string. There were photographs, more than a dozen of them, showing Elizabeth at different ages, with different people. There were documents, a birth certificate, a high school diploma from Pine Ridge High School class of 1972, a nursing certificate, a deed to property. Maya's breath caught when she saw the deed. It was for this cabin, this land, registered to Elizabeth Marie Brennan, dated April 1983. So Elizabeth had owned this place legally. It wasn't just some squatter's shack. This was her property, her home. Beneath the documents were letters, dozens of them still sealed in their envelopes. The return addresses were from different places, Denver, California, even one from Texas. But Elizabeth had never opened them. Maya's hands shook as she carefully closed the box and set it back where she'd found it. She backed toward the door, her mind reeling. This was bigger than she'd thought. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. This was a mystery, a real mystery, with a real person at the center of it. She stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind her, making sure the latch caught. The sun was lower now, painting the clearing in shades of amber and gold. The temperature had dropped, and Maya's breath formed clouds in the air. She stood there for a long moment, looking back at the cabin. Part of her wanted to run straight into town, to find someone in authority, to tell them what she'd found. But another part of her, a stronger part, wanted to keep this secret. At least for now. At least until she understood what had happened to Elizabeth Brennan, and why no one had come looking for her or her home. Maya descended the porch steps and walked back across the clearing to the tree line. Just before she entered the forest, she turned and looked back one more time. The cabin sat there, silent and patient, keeping its secrets in the gathering dusk. She memorized the landmarks, the distinctive granite outcropping behind the cabin, the cluster of 3 dead trees to the east, the shape of the ridgeline above. She would find her way back. She had to. The hike down was faster than the climb up, but Maya moved carefully, not wanting to risk an injury this far from help. By the time she reached the main trail, the sky had turned purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. She jogged the last mile back to the trailhead, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. The trailer park was quiet when she got home. Most people were inside, their windows glowing with the blue light of television screens. Maya let herself in through the back door and stood in the kitchen, her heart still racing from the hike and from what she'd discovered. She dropped her backpack on the floor and walked to the sink for a glass of water. As she drank, she stared out the window at the dark shape of the mountains rising against the night sky. Up there, hidden among those peaks and valleys, was a cabin no one claimed, a home frozen in time, and a story no one knew. Maya dried her hands on a dish towel and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she did her homework. She pulled out a notebook and opened to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, Elizabeth Brennan, March 1983 to? Below that, she began to list everything she remembered from the cabin. The journal, the letters, the photographs, the deed, the dates. She wrote down questions. Why did Elizabeth leave town? What lies was she talking about? Where did she go? Is she still alive? She worked until her hand cramped, filling 3 pages with observations and questions. When she finally stopped, it was past 9 o'clock. Her mother would be home in a few hours, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. Maya would be asleep by then, or pretending to be. She closed the notebook and hid it under her mattress, something she'd learned to do with anything she didn't want her mother to worry about. Not that Sarah had the energy to snoop, but Maya had become skilled at carrying her own burdens quietly. That night, lying in bed with the sounds of the trailer settling around her, Maya couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about Elizabeth standing on that porch in the photograph, smiling at whoever held the camera, about the unopened letters and the untouched belongings and the journal entries that hinted at pain and betrayal. She thought about the way the cabin had felt, not abandoned, but waiting, like it had been holding its breath for 37 years, hoping someone would finally come and set it free. Maya didn't know yet what she would do with her discovery. She didn't know if she should tell someone or keep investigating on her own. All she knew was that something had shifted inside her the moment she stepped through that cabin door. She'd found something that mattered, something bigger than her small life in the trailer park, bigger than the loneliness that followed her through school hallways. She'd found a mystery. And for the first time in her 11 years, Maya felt like she had a purpose. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the thin walls of the trailer. But Maya barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning her return to the mountains, imagining what other secrets the cabin might hold, wondering if somewhere in that frozen moment of 1986, she might find the key to understanding what had happened to Elizabeth Brennan. And why, in a town as small as Pine Ridge, no one had ever thought to ask where she'd gone. Maya returned to the cabin 3 days later. She'd spent those 72 hours in a state of barely contained restlessness, going through the motions of school and homework while her mind remained fixed on that clearing high in the San Isabel National Forest. She'd read and reread her notes, memorizing every detail, planning her next visit. The weather forecast called for clear skies through the weekend, and her mother had picked up extra shifts at the diner, which meant Maya would have entire afternoons to herself. Saturday morning arrived crisp and cold. Maya packed her backpack more carefully this time. 2 water bottles, granola bars, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and the notebook where she'd been recording her observations. She also brought something else, a disposable camera she'd bought with the $7 she'd saved from helping Mrs. Patterson next door with her groceries. 27 exposures. She needed to document what she'd found. The hike up felt different this time. Familiar. The game trail that had seemed so mysterious before now felt like it belonged to her, like it was leading her home. She made good time, reaching the old logging road in just under an hour. When the cabin came into view through the trees, her heart lifted in a way that surprised her. It was still there, still waiting. She approached more confidently than before, crossing the clearing in long strides and climbing the porch steps without hesitation. The latch lifted easily under her hand, and she stepped inside. The cabin greeted her with its particular smell of dust and thyme and mountain air. Maya stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, feeling the weight of the silence. Then she got to work. She started with the photographs in the wooden box on the kitchen counter. Carefully, she removed each one and laid them out on the table in chronological order based on how old Elizabeth looked in each image. The earliest showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of a house with white siding and a large front porch. The photo was in color, faded to that particular yellow-orange tint of pictures from the 1960s. A man and woman stood behind the girl, their hands on her shoulders. Parents, Maya assumed. The next few photos showed Elizabeth progressing through childhood and adolescence, school pictures, birthday parties, a photo of her in a cheerleading uniform that made Maya smile. Elizabeth had been part of the world once, normal, connected, happy. What had changed? The later photographs told a different story. Elizabeth in her 20s, wearing nursing scrubs, standing outside what looked like a hospital. Her smile was different in these pictures, more reserved, more careful. Then a photo that made Maya's breath catch. Elizabeth with a man, both of them dressed for what looked like a wedding or formal event. He had his arm around her waist. She was leaning into him. They both looked radiantly happy. Maya turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Elizabeth and James, Spring 1979. She set the photo aside and continued through the stack. More pictures of Elizabeth and James, hiking, sitting by a campfire, standing in front of a Christmas tree. Young love documented in chemical emulsion and cardboard frames. And then, abruptly, the photographs of James stopped. The remaining pictures showed only Elizabeth alone, her smile growing thinner and more strained with each image until, in the final photograph, she wasn't smiling at all. Maya gathered the photos carefully and returned them to the box. She picked up the camera and took several shots of the table, the kitchen area, the books on the shelf. Each click of the shutter felt significant, like she was preserving evidence of something important. Next, she turned her attention to the journal. She'd only read the first few entries last time, and now she wanted to go deeper. She settled into one of the chairs at the table, opened to where she'd left off, and began to read. Elizabeth's entries painted a picture of increasing isolation, but also of fierce independence. She wrote about learning to hunt, about installing solar panels on the roof for minimal electricity, about digging a root cellar into the hillside behind the cabin to store food through the winter. She described the sound of elk bugling in September, the way snow muffled everything in January, the particular quality of light on spring mornings when the forest came back to life. But woven through these observations were darker threads, references to what they said and what they believed, and the truth no one wanted to hear. Elizabeth never spelled out exactly what had happened, but Maya began to piece together a narrative of accusation and betrayal, of a small town turning against one of its own. One entry from June 1985 was particularly revealing. "Ran into Tom Harper on the trail today. He was as shocked to see me as I was to see him. We stood there staring at each other for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to speak or run. He finally asked if I was living up here. I told him it was none of his business. He said people in town had wondered what happened to me. I said people in town had made it very clear they didn't want me around. He looked ashamed, but he didn't apologize. They never do. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I told him I needed to be left alone. He nodded and walked away. I wonder if he'll tell anyone he saw me. I wonder if anyone will care." Maya read the entry 3 times, committing it to memory. Tom Harper. She'd heard that name before. There was a Harper Auto Repair on Main Street, and the owner was an older man named Tom. Could it be the same person? She continued reading, moving through the seasons of 1985 and into early 1986. The entries grew shorter, more sporadic. Elizabeth wrote less about her daily survival and more about memory, about the past, about regret and loss. The final entry was dated July 2nd, 1986. 29 years old today, spent it alone as expected. Sometimes I think about going back down there and making them listen, making them understand what really happened. But what's the point? They've already decided who to believe, and it wasn't me. James would have been 31 next month. Hard to believe he's been gone 7 years. Hard to believe I'm still here, still breathing, still waking up to mountains that don't judge me. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. And then nothing. No more entries. The rest of the journal's pages were blank. Maya closed the book slowly, her mind racing. James had died. That much was clear. And somehow his death was connected to whatever had driven Elizabeth into the mountains. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "James died 1979. Elizabeth blamed. Town turned against her. Why?" She stood and walked to the bookshelf, examining the titles more carefully. Most were what you'd expect. Practical guides, novels, classics. But tucked between two field guides was something different. A newspaper folded and yellowed with age. Maya pulled it out carefully. It was the Pine Ridge Gazette, dated August 14th, 1979. The headline read, "Local man dies in tragic accident. Community mourns loss of James Whitmore." Maya's hands shook as she unfolded the brittle paper. The article described how James Whitmore, aged 23, had died in a hiking accident in the San Isabel National Forest. He'd apparently fallen from a rocky outcropping during a solo hike. His body had been found by other hikers 2 days later. He was described as a beloved member of the community, a volunteer firefighter recently engaged to Elizabeth Brennan, a nurse at Pine Ridge Medical Center. The article was straightforward, factual, sympathetic. But beneath it, in the same edition, was a smaller piece, more of an editorial or opinion column. The headline read, "Questions remain after Whitmore tragedy." Maya read it with growing horror. The columnist, whose name was listed as Margaret Finch, raised questions about the circumstances of James's death. Why had he been hiking alone when he usually hiked with Elizabeth? Why had Elizabeth waited a full day before reporting him missing? Why were there conflicting accounts of what she'd told authorities? The piece stopped short of making direct accusations, but the implication was clear. Margaret Finch thought something didn't add up. Maya set the newspaper down and walked to the window, trying to process what she'd learned. The pieces were starting to fit together. James had died. People had questions. Those questions had apparently become suspicions, and Elizabeth, rather than defend herself, had fled to the mountains. But why? If she was innocent, why run? Why hide? Maya spent the next 2 hours going through every drawer, every box, every corner of the cabin. She found more newspapers, all from the same period in 1979, each one containing articles or letters to the editor about James's death. The tone grew increasingly hostile as the weeks progressed. By September, people were openly speculating that Elizabeth had been involved somehow. Someone suggested she'd pushed him. Someone else claimed they'd heard the couple arguing the day before he died. The rumors had snowballed, gaining weight and speed until they'd crushed any hope Elizabeth had of a normal life in Pine Ridge. In a metal lockbox under the bed, Maya found something that made her gasp. A letter, handwritten on legal paper, dated October 15, 1979. It was from a lawyer, advising Elizabeth that while the sheriff's department had officially ruled James's death an accident, public sentiment was strongly against her, and that she might want to consider relocating for her own safety and peace of mind. Maya photographed everything: the newspapers, the letter, pages from the journal, the photographs of Elizabeth and James. She was running out of film, down to the last few exposures, but she needed this documented, needed proof of what she'd found. As the afternoon light began to slant through the windows, Maya realized she needed to head back. But before she left, she did one more sweep of the cabin, looking for anything she might have missed. That's when she noticed something odd about the wood-burning stove in the corner. It sat on a raised platform of bricks and stones, which made sense for fire safety, but the platform seemed larger than necessary, extending several feet beyond the stove itself. Maya knelt down and examined the bricks. They were loose, not mortared together. She carefully lifted one, then another. Beneath the bricks was a hollow space, and inside that space was a metal box, similar to the one under the bed but larger. Maya's heart hammered as she pulled it out. It was heavy, and when she opened it, she understood why. Inside were documents, legal documents, police reports, medical records, all related to James Whitmore's death. And tucked into a folder labeled Evidence were photographs, crime scene photographs of the location where James had fallen. Maya's stomach turned as she looked at them, but she forced herself to study each one carefully. What she saw didn't match the narrative in the newspapers. The photos showed a rocky area, yes, but it wasn't particularly high or dangerous looking, maybe 10 or 12 feet. James had been an experienced hiker. Why would he fall from something so manageable? And there, in one of the photos, something Maya's 11-year-old mind almost missed, a close-up of James's hiking boot, and near it, what looked like rope fibers. She pulled out a police report. It was thorough, detailed, and it concluded that James had slipped and fallen, hitting his head on the rocks below. Accidental death. But stapled to the back of the report was a handwritten note from Elizabeth, apparently submitted to the sheriff's department weeks after James's death. In it, she explained that James had been teaching himself rock climbing techniques and had brought rope with him that day to practice. She'd told him it was dangerous to practice alone, but he'd been confident. She'd believed, based on the rope fibers and the position of his body, that he might have been attempting to rappel down the outcropping when something went wrong with his anchor or his technique. The sheriff's department had apparently dismissed this theory, noting that there was no climbing equipment found at the scene other than the rope fragments. But Elizabeth had underlined one sentence multiple times. "I told them to search more carefully. I told them James had a full climbing kit in his truck. They said the truck was empty when they found it." Maya sat back on her heels, her mind spinning. Someone had taken James's climbing equipment from his truck. Someone had removed evidence from the scene. And Elizabeth, in trying to explain what had really happened, had only made herself look more suspicious. She carefully returned everything to the metal box and replaced it under the bricks. She stood, brushed the dust from her jeans, and looked around the cabin one more time. This place held more than memories. It held truth, a truth that had been buried for 37 years. Maya locked the cabin door behind her and started down the mountain. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She moved quickly, urgency pushing her forward. She needed to tell someone. She couldn't carry this alone anymore. But who? Her mother was barely keeping her head above water and didn't have the bandwidth for a decades-old mystery. The police? They'd been the ones to close the case in the first place. A teacher? Most of them barely noticed Maya existed. By the time she reached the trailhead, the stars were beginning to appear. Maya stood in the parking area, empty except for her mother's old Honda, which she'd borrowed that morning. She looked back up at the dark mass of the mountains, knowing the cabin was up there, keeping its secrets. She drove home slowly, her mind made up. There was one person in Pine Ridge who might listen, one person who'd always been kind to her, even when others hadn't. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the town librarian. Eleanor Vance had worked at the Pine Ridge Public Library for 43 years. She knew everyone, remembered everything, and had a reputation for discretion and fairness. She'd helped Maya countless times with school projects, never making her feel less than because of where she lived or how she dressed. Monday after school, Maya walked into the library with her backpack heavy with notes and her disposable camera, now fully used and ready for development. The library was quiet, nearly empty. Mrs. Vance sat behind the circulation desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, sorting through returned books. She looked up when Maya approached and smiled. "Hello, dear. Looking for something specific today?" Maya glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Mrs. Vance, I need to ask you about something important, and I need you to promise you won't tell anyone until I'm ready." Eleanor's expression shifted from friendly to concerned. She set down the book she was holding and gave Maya her full attention. "That sounds serious. Are you in trouble?" "No," Maya said, "but I found something up in the mountains, and I think it's connected to something that happened a long time ago." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then stood. "Let's talk in my office." The office was small, cluttered with books and papers, but private. Eleanor closed the door and gestured for Maya to sit. She took the chair across from her and folded her hands. "I'm listening." Maya took a deep breath and began. She told Eleanor everything, finding the cabin, reading the journal, discovering the newspapers and police reports, learning about Elizabeth Brennan and James Whitmore. She showed her notes, explained what she'd found, described the evidence that suggested James's death might not have been the simple accident everyone believed. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as Maya spoke. When Maya finally finished, Eleanor sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Elizabeth Brennan," she finally said, her voice soft with memory. I remember her. She was a few years younger than me, but Pine Ridge is small. Everyone knew everyone. She was a good person, Maya. Kind, competent, dedicated to her work at the hospital. What happened after James died? Maya asked. Eleanor sighed. Exactly what you discovered. The town turned on her. You have to understand, James Whitmore was, well, he was special. Everyone loved him. When he died, people needed someone to blame. Accidents are random, senseless. But if someone was responsible, if someone had caused it, then it made sense. It had meaning. But there was no evidence she did anything wrong, Maya said. There didn't need to be, Eleanor replied sadly. Suspicion was enough. People started avoiding her. She lost her job at the hospital, said it was a mutual decision, but everyone knew better. She stopped coming to church, stopped going to the grocery store. And then, sometime in late 1979 or early 1980, she just disappeared. Most people assumed she'd left town entirely. She didn't leave, Maya said. She just went up. Eleanor nodded slowly. So it seems. And she stayed there for years, according to her journal. Until at least July of 1986, Maya confirmed. That's when the entries stop. What happens next will unravel a decades-old mystery, reveal the truth behind a tragedy no one wanted to question, and prove that sometimes the quietest voices deserve to be heard the loudest. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. And no one ever found her? Maya asked. In all those years? Eleanor shook her head. If they did, I never heard about it. But Maya, think about it. If people believed she was guilty of something, even without proof, they might have been relieved when she disappeared. Out of sight, out of mind. They could move on without having to confront their own role in driving her away. Maya felt anger rising in her chest. That's not fair. No, Eleanor agreed. It's not, but it's human. People are complicated, Maya. They do terrible things sometimes, even good people, especially when they're scared or grieving. Maya leaned forward. Mrs. Vance, I think someone took James's climbing equipment from his truck. I think someone removed evidence. Elizabeth tried to tell the police, but they didn't listen. What if she was right? What if there's more to this than anyone realized? Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. That's a serious accusation. I know, Maya said, but it's in the police report. Elizabeth's statement. She said James had a full climbing kit and it was gone. Someone took it. Eleanor stood and walked to her window, looking out at Main Street. If what you're saying is true, if someone did remove evidence, the question is why? What would anyone gain from hiding the fact that James was practicing climbing techniques? Maybe they didn't want people to know he was up there doing something risky, Maya suggested. Maybe they blamed Elizabeth for not stopping him, so they made it look like a simple fall instead of a climbing accident. Or, Eleanor said slowly, turning back to face Maya, maybe there was something else at the scene, something someone didn't want found. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. Like what? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But I think we need to find out. And I think we need to find out what happened to Elizabeth. Is she still alive? Did she ever leave that cabin? Where did she go? Will you help me? Maya asked. Eleanor returned to her chair and met Maya's eyes. Yes, but we have to be careful. If people in this town didn't want to hear the truth 37 years ago, they might not want to hear it now either. And if someone did remove evidence, if someone did cover something up, they won't be happy about us digging it back up. Over the next week, Maya and Eleanor became partners in investigation. They met at the library every day after school, always in Eleanor's office, always behind closed doors. Eleanor had access to town records, old newspapers, census data. She taught Maya how to search, how to cross-reference, how to build a timeline. They discovered that the sheriff who'd handled James's case, a man named Walter Crenshaw, had died in 2012. The deputy who'd assisted him, though, was still alive. Thomas Harper. The same Tom Harper from the auto repair shop. The same man Elizabeth had run into on the trail in 1985. Eleanor found property records showing that Elizabeth had indeed purchased the land where her cabin stood in April of 1983, paying cash. She'd never sold it. According to county records, Elizabeth Marie Brennan still owned 5 acres in Section 12 of the San Isabel National Forest. Which means, Eleanor said, legally, that cabin and everything in it still belongs to her. Or to her estate if she's deceased. They searched for death records. Nothing. They searched for Elizabeth in other states, other cities. Nothing conclusive. It was as if she'd simply vanished from official records after 1986. "We need to talk to Tom Harper," Maya said one afternoon. Eleanor hesitated. "He's not going to want to discuss this, especially not with an 11-year-old girl and a librarian." "But he saw her," Maya insisted. "In 1985. He knows she was up there. He might know more." "Or he might warn whoever else might be watching," Eleanor countered. Maya frowned. "You think someone's watching?" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that secrets this old, in a town this small, have a way of protecting themselves. People have investments in the official story, reputations, legacies. We need to be smart about this." But Maya was impatient. She'd spent her whole life being invisible, being ignored. Now she'd found something real, something important. She wanted action. That Friday afternoon, without telling Eleanor, Maya walked into Harper Auto Repair. The shop smelled like oil and metal and hard work. Tom Harper was in his late 60s now, his hair completely white, his hands permanently stained with grease. He looked up from under the hood of a truck when Maya entered. "Help you?" he asked, not unkindly. Maya's courage almost failed her. But she thought of Elizabeth, alone in that cabin, and forced herself to speak. "Mr. Harper, my name is Maya. I need to ask you about someone. About Elizabeth Brennan." The change in Tom Harper's face was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from his cheeks. His hand, holding a wrench, froze in mid-air. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found her cabin," Maya said simply. "Up in the San Isabel. I've been reading her journals, looking at her things. I know about James Whitmore. I know about what happened." Tom set down the wrench carefully and wiped his hands on a rag. His jaw worked like he was trying to decide what to say. Finally, he spoke. "You need to leave that alone, kid. That's old business. Finished business." "But it's not finished," Maya said. "Elizabeth never got to tell her side. Everyone just assumed—" "I said leave it alone!" Tom's voice was sharp now, hard. "You don't know what you're messing with. That situation was handled. It's done." "Handled how?" Maya pressed. "By making her leave? By taking James's climbing equipment so no one would know he was doing something dangerous?" Tom's eyes went wide. For a second, Maya thought he might grab her, might physically throw her out of the shop. But instead, he just stood there, breathing hard, staring at her like she was a ghost. "How do you know about the equipment?" he whispered. "It's in the police report," Maya said. "Elizabeth's statement. She told the sheriff that James had a full climbing kit, but it was gone. Someone took it." Tom turned away from her, facing the truck, his shoulders rigid. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "You need to go. Now. And you need to forget about this." "But now!" He spun back around, and Maya saw something in his face that frightened her. Not anger, fear. She backed toward the door, her heart hammering. "Why are you scared, Mr. Harper? What are you afraid I'll find?" But Tom just shook his head and turned his back on her. Maya ran from the shop, her mind racing. Tom Harper knew something that still terrified him 37 years later, something worth protecting even now. She ran all the way to the library, burst through the doors, and found Eleanor shelving books. "We need to talk," she gasped. "Right now." In the office, Maya told Eleanor what had happened. Eleanor's face grew pale as she listened. "Maya, you shouldn't have gone there alone. If Tom Harper was involved in covering something up, confronting him was dangerous." "But he knows something," Maya insisted. "You should have seen his face when I mentioned the climbing equipment. He was terrified." Eleanor stood and began pacing. Terrified of what, though? Of being caught? Or of something else? What do you mean? Eleanor stopped and looked at Maya. What if Tom Harper wasn't covering up evidence to protect himself? What if he was protecting someone else? The question hung in the air between them. Who? Maya asked. I don't know, Eleanor said, but I think it's time we found out. And I think I know where to start. She walked to her filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. I've been doing some digging of my own. Margaret Finch, the woman who wrote those opinion pieces questioning Elizabeth, she's still alive. She lives in an assisted living facility in Denver, but she's still sharp. I called her yesterday. Maya's eyes went wide. You did? I wanted to know why she'd been so convinced Elizabeth was hiding something. She told me something interesting. She said that the day before James died, she saw him arguing with someone in the parking lot behind the hardware store. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but James was angry. Really angry. She'd never seen him like that before. Who was he arguing with? Maya asked. Eleanor met her eyes. She couldn't remember the name, but she said he was young, wore a deputy's uniform, and drove a sheriff's department vehicle. Maya's breath caught. Thomas Harper. He was the deputy on the case. Exactly, Eleanor said. And 2 days later, James was dead, and Tom Harper was in charge of processing the scene. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture neither of them wanted to see. But Maya couldn't stop now. Wouldn't stop. What do we do? She asked. Eleanor closed the folder. We keep digging, carefully, quietly, and we find out what really happened on that mountain in August of 1979, because I don't think James Whitmore's death was an accident, and I don't think Elizabeth Brennan was the one responsible. The following Monday, Eleanor called Maya's mother. Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice tired and wary. Hello? Mrs. Chen, this is Eleanor Vance from the Pine Ridge Library. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. There was a pause. Is Maya in trouble? Not at all, Eleanor assured her. Actually, I'm calling because Maya has been doing some remarkable research work, and I'd like your permission to involve her in a special project. It would require some after-school time, possibly some weekend work, but I promise she'll be supervised and safe. Another pause, longer this time. What kind of project? Eleanor had prepared for this. Local history preservation. Maya discovered some information about a historical property in the National Forest, and I think she could help document it for the County Historical Society. It would look wonderful on college applications someday. The magic words. College applications. A future beyond the trailer park. Sarah's voice softened. She'd really be helping? She already has been, Eleanor said truthfully. Your daughter is special, Mrs. Chen. She sees things others miss. That evening, Sarah signed a permission form Eleanor had drafted, barely reading it, just grateful that someone saw value in her daughter. Maya felt a pang of guilt for not telling her mother the whole truth, but Eleanor had been right. This investigation was becoming complicated, potentially dangerous. The less Sarah knew, the safer she'd be. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya and Eleanor worked like archaeologists, excavating a buried city. They combed through old newspapers, interviewing anyone who'd been in Pine Ridge during the late 1970s. Most people's memories were hazy, filtered through 4 decades and the collective agreement to forget. But slowly, details emerged. James Whitmore had worked for the National Forest Service in the summer of 1979, conducting trail maintenance and wildlife surveys. He'd been well-liked, hard-working, engaged to Elizabeth with a wedding planned for the following spring. But in the weeks before his death, several people remembered him becoming withdrawn, distracted, arguing with his supervisor about something. That supervisor's name was in the old Forest Service records, David Harper, Tom Harper's older brother. It's always a Harper, Maya muttered, staring at the personnel file Eleanor had requested through a Freedom of Information Act submission. David Harper had died in 2007, but Eleanor tracked down his widow Martha, who still lived in Pine Ridge in a neat brick house on Elm Street. She agreed to meet them on a Saturday afternoon, serving tea and cookies in a living room filled with photographs of children and grandchildren. Martha was 71, her hair silver, her hands marked with age spots. But her mind was sharp, and when Eleanor mentioned James Whitmore, her expression grew troubled. "I always felt badly about James," Martha said quietly. "David did too, though he never said it outright. Men of that generation didn't talk about feelings much." "Mrs. Harper," Eleanor said gently, "we're trying to understand what happened. Not to cause trouble, but because we think there might be more to the story than people knew." Martha set down her teacup. "James found something, up in the forest. David never told me exactly what, but it was something that wasn't supposed to be there, something illegal." Maya leaned forward. "What kind of illegal?" "I don't know for certain," Martha said. "But I remember David coming home angry one night in July. He said James was threatening to go to federal authorities about something, and it was going to cause problems for a lot of people. David told him to leave it alone, that it wasn't his business." "Did James leave it alone?" Eleanor asked. Martha shook her head. "No, he and David had a terrible argument. I heard part of it. James said someone needed to stop it before people got hurt. David said James was being naive, that he didn't understand how things worked. Then David told James he needed to talk to Tom before he did anything stupid." "Tom Harper," Maya said. "David's brother, the deputy." "Yes," Martha confirmed. "David thought Tom could talk some sense into James, explain the realities of the situation." "And did he?" Eleanor asked. Martha looked down at her hands. "I don't know. 2 days after that conversation, James was dead. David was devastated. He blamed himself, said he should have listened to James, should have backed him up. He never forgave himself." "Did he ever say what James had found?" Maya pressed. "No," Martha said. "But after James died, David changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He quit the Forest Service 6 months later and started working at the lumber mill. Said he couldn't stomach being in those woods anymore." She paused. "And Tom, he left the sheriff's department around the same time, opened his auto shop. Both of them just walked away from jobs they'd held for years." Maya and Eleanor exchanged glances. Men didn't abandon careers in a town like Pine Ridge without reason. "Mrs. Harper," Eleanor said carefully, "do you think James's death was really an accident?" Martha was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I think James knew something that made him dangerous to someone, and I think whoever that someone was, they wanted him silenced. Whether it was intentional or just convenient, I can't say, but I've wondered for 37 years." They left Martha Harper's house with more questions than answers. As they walked back toward Eleanor's car, Maya's mind raced. James found something illegal in the forest, something worth protecting, worth killing for. "Possibly," Eleanor said. "But we need to be careful about making accusations we can't prove." What could have been up there? Maya wondered aloud. In the late 70s? What would be illegal enough that people would cover up a death? Eleanor stopped walking. "I might know someone who can tell us, but Maya, if we go down this road, there's no turning back. Are you sure you want to keep going?" Maya thought about Elizabeth, alone in that cabin for years, carrying the weight of suspicion and grief. She thought about the unopened letters, the journal entries filled with pain, the life frozen in place because no one had believed her. "I'm sure," Maya said. The someone Eleanor knew was a retired forest ranger named Vincent Ortega. He was 82 years old and lived in a cabin even more remote than Elizabeth's, accessible only by a rough four-wheel drive road. Eleanor drove them there the following Sunday in her ancient Subaru, the vehicle bouncing and groaning over ruts and rocks. Vincent greeted them on his porch, a tall man made taller by excellent posture, his face weathered like old leather. He'd agreed to talk only because Eleanor had called in a favor. He'd helped her research a book about Pine Ridge history 10 years earlier. They sat on his porch, drinking coffee that could strip paint, and Eleanor explained what they were investigating. Vincent listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When Eleanor finished, Vincent set down his mug. "You're talking about the grow operation." Maya blinked. The what? Marijuana, Vincent said bluntly. Back in the late 70s, there were several large-scale growing operations hidden in the national forest, remote locations near water sources, far from trails. It was a big problem. The Forest Service and DEA were trying to shut them down, but these operations were well protected. People made serious money, and they didn't take kindly to interference. Eleanor's eyes widened. You think James found one of these operations? I'd bet my pension on it, Vincent said. Summer of '79, we lost 2 operations that were about to be raided. Someone tipped them off. The crops were destroyed, the equipment gone by the time we got there. There was a lot of speculation about who the leak was, but nothing was ever proven. Who did people suspect? Maya asked. Vincent hesitated, then said, There were rumors, whispers that someone in local law enforcement was on the payroll, someone who could provide advance warning about raids, keep the growers one step ahead of us. Tom Harper, Eleanor said. He was a deputy. I'm not naming names, Vincent said firmly, but I will say this. When those operations disappeared, so did any chance of catching the people running them. And not long after, certain individuals in Pine Ridge suddenly had money they hadn't had before. New trucks, renovations on houses, investments in businesses. Maya's mind was spinning. So if James found evidence that Tom Harper was dirty, was protecting drug operations, that would be a motive for wanting James quiet, Eleanor finished. Vincent nodded grimly. Those operations were violent, young lady. People got hurt, sometimes killed. If James stumbled onto one and tried to expose it, especially if he had evidence implicating a law enforcement officer, he trailed off, the implication clear. What happened to the operations eventually? Eleanor asked. They moved, Vincent said. Farther into the wilderness, onto private land where we had less jurisdiction. By the mid-80s, the problem had shifted elsewhere. But the damage was done. Good men had died, families were destroyed, and the people responsible just melted back into normal life. They drove back to Pine Ridge in silence, both of them processing what they'd learned. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. James Whitmore had likely discovered evidence of Tom Harper's involvement in protecting illegal marijuana operations. He'd threatened to expose it, and somehow, before he could, he'd ended up dead at the bottom of a rocky outcropping with his climbing equipment mysteriously missing. Elizabeth had known something was wrong. She'd tried to tell the authorities, but the authorities included the very person who had reason to keep the truth buried. So she'd been dismissed, suspected, driven away. And she'd hidden herself in the mountains, keeping her evidence, waiting for someone to finally believe her. We need to go back to the cabin, Maya said suddenly. Eleanor glanced at her. Why? Because Elizabeth kept police reports, evidence, photographs. If James had proof of what he'd found, proof of Tom's involvement, Elizabeth might have it. She might have hidden it up there. The next Saturday, they made the hike together. Eleanor was in decent shape for 63, but the altitude and terrain tested her. Maya slowed her pace, patient, guiding Eleanor up the game trail and along the old logging road. When the cabin came into view, Eleanor stopped, breathing hard, staring. My God, she whispered. It's exactly as you described, like she just stepped out for a walk. They spent hours searching, going through boxes and drawers Maya had already examined, looking with fresh eyes and new context. Eleanor found a stack of topographical maps in a drawer. Several areas were circled in red ink, all within a 10-mile radius of the cabin. Notes in the margins. Jay said plants here, equipment here, told Ath about this one, gone 2 days later. She was mapping the grow operations, Eleanor said. Elizabeth knew what James had found. Maya was searching under the bed when her fingers touched something taped to the underside of the mattress support. She pulled, and a large manila envelope came free, sealed with brittle tape. Mrs. Vance, she called. I found something. They opened the envelope together. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens. The images showed a clearing in the forest, rows of marijuana plants, irrigation equipment, armed men standing guard. And in several photos, clearly visible, was a sheriff's department vehicle. In one particularly damning image, Tom Harper stood next to one of the armed men, both of them smiling, shaking hands. "James took these," Eleanor breathed. "This is what he found." There was more. A written statement, signed by James and dated August 10th, 1979, 4 days before he died. In it, James detailed what he'd discovered: a large-scale marijuana growing operation on federal land protected by Deputy Thomas Harper in exchange for payment. James had documented 3 separate sites, had photographs, had witnessed Harper meeting with the growers. He'd planned to submit the evidence to the FBI field office in Denver on August 18th. He never made it. "We have to take this to the authorities," Maya said. "Which authorities?" Eleanor asked. "Tom Harper might be retired, but he still has friends in the sheriff's department. Friends who might not want this coming to light." "Then who?" Maya felt frustration rising. "We can't just sit on this." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but we need to be strategic. We need to—" She was cut off by the sound of an engine. Both of them froze. Through the cabin window, they saw a truck pulling into the clearing. A newer model, 4-wheel drive, and behind it, another vehicle. "Someone followed us," Maya whispered, fear creeping up her spine. The truck doors opened. Tom Harper stepped out, older and grayer than when Maya had confronted him at his shop, but unmistakable. With him was a younger man in his 40s, wearing a sheriff's department uniform. Deputy Ryan Garrison, according to the name tag visible even from this distance. Eleanor quickly gathered the photographs and James's statement, stuffing them back into the envelope. "Is there a back way out of here?" Maya thought fast. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin. We can hide there, wait for them to leave." But it was too late. Tom Harper was already climbing the porch steps. His voice boomed through the door. "I know you're in there, Eleanor. Your car's at the trailhead. We need to talk." Eleanor squeezed Maya's hand. "Stay calm. Let me handle this." She opened the door. Tom stood there, Deputy Garrison behind him. Tom's face was hard, but Maya saw something else in his eyes. Not anger, resignation. "You shouldn't have come here," Tom said. "This is Elizabeth Brennan's property," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "We have permission to be here." "From who?" Garrison asked. "Elizabeth Brennan's been dead for 20 years. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. "What?" Garrison looked surprised that she'd spoken. "You didn't know? Elizabeth Brennan died in 2003. Heart failure. She was found in a halfway house in Nevada. Took them 6 months to identify her because she'd been using a different name." Maya felt tears spring to her eyes. Elizabeth had died alone, far from home, still carrying the burden of what had happened. "How do you know that?" Eleanor asked quietly. Garrison glanced at Tom, who nodded. "Because I've been paying for her burial plot in Nevada for the last 20 years, Tom said, "and making sure no one in Pine Ridge knew where she'd gone or what had happened to her." The confession hung in the air. Eleanor's grip on the envelope tightened. "Why would you do that?" Tom's face crumpled. For a moment he looked every one of his 68 years. "Because it was my fault she ran. My fault she lived up here alone for all those years. My fault she died without ever coming home." "You protected the people who killed James," Maya said, her voice shaking with anger. "You took his climbing equipment so no one would know what really happened. You made everyone think Elizabeth was responsible." "No," Tom said sharply. "I didn't make anyone think anything. People came to their own conclusions. I just didn't correct them." "That's the same thing," Maya shouted. "You're right," Tom said quietly. "It is. And I've lived with that for 37 years. Deputy Garrison shifted uncomfortably. "Tom, maybe we should—" "No," Tom interrupted. "They found it. They deserve to know the truth." He looked at Eleanor. "You found the photographs, didn't you? James's statement?" Eleanor didn't answer, which was answer enough. Tom nodded. "I figured. Elizabeth was too smart to destroy evidence. She kept it, hoping someday someone would listen." He walked to the cabin's porch railing and leaned against it heavily. "You want to know what happened? I'll tell you, but not here, not in her home. She deserves better than that." They gathered in the clearing, an unlikely group bound by secrets and time. Tom sat on a fallen log, and his voice, when he spoke, was heavy with regret. James did find the grow operation, and he did have evidence of my involvement. He came to me, showed me the photographs, said he was going to the FBI. I begged him not to. Told him it was more complicated than he knew, that he'd be putting people in danger. What people? Eleanor asked. My brother, Tom said. David. The growers had found out he was feeding information to the Forest Service about their locations. They threatened to kill him, kill Martha, kill their kids. So I made a deal. I'd provide counterintelligence, warn them about raids in exchange for my brother's safety. You became dirty to protect your family, Eleanor said. Yes, Tom admitted, and I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't let them hurt David. He was all the family I had left after our parents died. What happened to James? Maya asked. Tom's voice broke. I don't know. I swear to God, I don't know. I met with him the day before he died. Tried one more time to convince him to drop it. He refused, said some things were more important than protecting criminals. We argued. It got heated. And then he left. That was the last time I saw him alive. He paused, struggling with emotion. The next day, hikers found his body. When I processed the scene, I saw the rope fibers, saw signs that he'd been practicing climbing techniques. And I saw something else. What? Eleanor pressed. Evidence that he hadn't been alone. Footprints, fresh cigarette butts, a specific brand that the growers smoked. I knew what had happened. They'd found out about his evidence, probably followed him, confronted him. Maybe they meant to scare him, maybe they meant to kill him. Either way, he ended up dead. And you covered it up, Maya said. I removed the evidence that anyone else had been there, Tom confirmed. Took James's climbing equipment to make it look like a simple accident. I told myself I was protecting my brother, keeping him safe. But really, I was protecting myself. I was a coward. What happens next will expose a conspiracy of silence spanning nearly 4 decades, force an entire town to confront its buried guilt, and prove that Maya's discovery was never just about a cabin in the mountains, but about giving voice to those who were silenced. Stay tuned to see how this unfolds. If you're gripped by this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. What about Elizabeth? Eleanor asked. She tried to tell you what she suspected. She had James's evidence. She did, Tom said. She came to me 3 weeks after James died, showed me the maps, the photographs James had given her for safekeeping, said she knew I'd covered something up. I told her she was wrong, that she was grieving and looking for someone to blame. I lied to her face. Tears were streaming down his weathered face now. She looked at me and said, You know the truth, Tom. You'll have to live with that. And then she left. Couple months later, she bought this land, built this cabin. I saw her once, years later, on a trail. She told me she was waiting for someone brave enough to tell the truth. Why didn't you? Maya demanded. Why didn't you just tell people what really happened? Because by then, it was too late, Tom said. The growers had moved on. My brother had quit his job, was trying to rebuild his life. Elizabeth was gone, and James was dead. What good would the truth do except destroy more lives? It would have given Elizabeth her life back, Maya shouted. It would have cleared her name. I know, Tom whispered. And I tried. In 2003, when I found out she'd died, I tried to tell people, tried to explain, but no one wanted to hear it. The town had moved on. James's death was an old tragedy, best forgotten. And Elizabeth was just the woman who'd disappeared after her fiancé died. No one cared anymore. I care, Maya said fiercely. And Elizabeth cared. That's why she kept everything. That's why she waited. Garrison, who'd been silent throughout, finally spoke. So what now? You've got evidence of corruption from 1979 involving people who are either dead or too old to prosecute. The growers are long gone. What are you going to do with it? Eleanor looked at Maya. That's not our decision alone. This cabin, this evidence, it all belonged to Elizabeth. We need to honor her wishes. How? Maya asked. She's dead. We don't know what she wanted. Actually, Tom said, reaching into his jacket, we do. He pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Elizabeth left this with a lawyer in Nevada before she died. Instructions for what to do with her property if anything happened to her. The lawyer tracked me down in 2004, sent it to me. I've been holding on to it ever since. He handed it to Eleanor. I think she'd want you to open it now. Eleanor broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the same neat script Maya recognized from the journal. She read aloud, "To whoever finds this, if you're reading these words, then I'm gone, and someone has finally found my cabin. I've kept James's evidence all these years because the truth matters, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. James died trying to do the right thing. He deserves to be remembered for his courage, not as a cautionary tale about hiking safety. I don't want revenge. The people responsible have to live with what they've done, and that's punishment enough. What I want is acknowledgement. I want the town of Pine Ridge to know what really happened. I want James's death to mean something, and I want my name cleared, even if I'm not around to hear it. Use my cabin as you see fit. Use the evidence however you think best, but please tell the truth. That's all I ever wanted. Just the truth. Elizabeth Marie Brennan, April 2003. The clearing was silent, except for the wind in the pines. Maya felt something break open in her chest, a mixture of grief and determination so powerful it nearly knocked her over. We have to tell everyone, she said. We have to make them listen. Eleanor looked at Tom. Are you prepared for that? For what it will mean? Tom nodded slowly. I've been preparing for 37 years. It's time. Garrison cleared his throat. As an officer of the law, I should probably advise you that making this public could open up a lot of old wounds. There could be legal ramifications, lawsuits, criminal investigations, even if prosecutions are unlikely. I don't care, Tom said. I'm an old man. I've got nothing to protect anymore except my conscience, and that's been killing me for decades. If telling the truth destroys my reputation, so be it. It's less than I deserve. They spent the next hour in the cabin, going through everything, cataloguing what they had. The photographs, the statement, the journal entries, the maps. Eleanor took notes, organized everything into a timeline. Maya found herself looking at the photograph of Elizabeth on the wall, the young woman smiling in front of her refuge. I'm sorry we're so late, Maya whispered to the image. But we're here now. We won't let you be forgotten. As the sun began to set, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber, they locked the cabin door and began the hike down. Tom and Garrison had to walk slowly, neither used to the altitude or terrain. Maya stayed close to Eleanor, the envelope of evidence pressed against her chest like armor. At the trailhead, they paused. Tom looked back toward the mountains, barely visible now in the gathering darkness. Thank you, he said quietly, for being braver than I was, both of you. We're not done yet, Eleanor replied. The hard part is still ahead. She was right. Getting people to listen, to care about a 37-year-old tragedy, to acknowledge their own role in driving an innocent woman into exile, that would be the real challenge. But Maya had faced challenges before. She'd survived loneliness, poverty, invisibility. She'd found a cabin no one else had bothered to look for. She'd uncovered a truth no one else had wanted to find. She could do this too. The next morning, Eleanor made a call to the Pine Ridge Gazette, the same newspaper that had published Margaret Finch's opinion pieces in 1979. The editor, a woman named Rebecca Torres, agreed to meet them that afternoon. Rebecca was in her early 50s, a former investigative reporter for the Denver Post who'd moved to Pine Ridge for a quieter life. But when Eleanor laid out the evidence, when Maya told the story of finding the cabin and everything that had followed, Rebecca's reporter instincts kicked in. This is major, she said, flipping through the photographs. These are federal crimes. Corruption, possible murder, conspiracy. And you're saying Tom Harper is willing to go on record? He is, Eleanor confirmed. And you found all of this because an 11-year-old girl went hiking? Rebecca looked at Maya with something like awe. Maya felt herself blush. I just wanted to explore. You did more than explore, honey, Rebecca said. You gave a dead woman her voice back. That's not nothing. The article ran the following Sunday, taking up the entire front page and continuing for 3 more pages inside. The headline read, 37 years later, the truth about James Whitmore's death finally emerges. Rebecca had written it beautifully, weaving together interviews with Tom Harper, excerpts from Elizabeth's journal, testimony from Vincent Ortega and Martha Harper, and photographs from James's hidden evidence. She'd presented the facts clearly. James had discovered corruption, had been silenced, and Elizabeth had been wrongly suspected and driven away by a town unwilling to look too closely at the truth. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some people were horrified, unable to believe that Tom Harper, a respected business owner and former deputy, could have been involved in such corruption. Others were defensive, insisting that the evidence was circumstantial, that Tom was lying for attention, that this was all a ploy to slander the memory of good people. But many, especially those who'd known Elizabeth, responded with shame and regret. Letters poured into the Gazette's office. Phone calls flooded the newsroom. People who'd shunned Elizabeth in 1979 wrote about their guilt, their sorrow, their wish that they'd been braver. Maya's name was in the article, identified as the local student who discovered Elizabeth Brennan's cabin and preserved evidence. Within days, she went from invisible to infamous. Kids at school stared at her in the hallways. Teachers pulled her aside to ask if she was okay. Some parents called her a troublemaker, said she should have left the past alone. But others saw her differently, saw her as someone who'd done something important, someone who mattered. The school principal, Mr. Dawson, called Maya to his office a week after the article ran. She went with her stomach in knots, sure she was in trouble. Instead, he smiled at her. Miss Chen, I wanted to tell you that what you've done for this community, even if it's uncomfortable, is remarkable. You've reminded us that truth matters more than comfort. That's a lesson many adults still need to learn. Maya blinked back tears. Thank you. I also wanted to let you know that the County Historical Society has reached out. They want to work with you and Mrs. Vance to preserve Elizabeth Brennan's cabin as a historical site. They're calling it the Brennan Memorial Heritage Cabin. They'd like you to be part of the committee overseeing its preservation. Maya's heart soared. Really? Really, Mr. Dawson confirmed. You found it. You told her story. It's only right that you help decide what happens to it next. The following Saturday, a town meeting was held at the community center to discuss what should be done about the revelations. The building was packed, standing room only. Maya sat in the front row with Eleanor, her mother beside her, looking proud and slightly overwhelmed. Tom Harper stood at the podium, his voice steady as he gave his full statement, holding nothing back. He admitted his role, explained his reasoning, accepted full responsibility. When he finished, the room erupted in shouting, some calling for his prosecution, others for forgiveness. But then Eleanor stood and raised her hand. The room gradually quieted. I understand the anger, she said. I share it. What Tom did was wrong, and he knows it. But prosecuting an elderly man for crimes committed 40 years ago won't bring James Whitmore back. It won't erase what happened to Elizabeth Brennan. What it will do is allow us to feel righteous while avoiding our own responsibility. She turned to face the crowd. Every single person in this room who was here in 1979, you had a choice. You could have believed Elizabeth. You could have questioned the official story. You could have demanded a real investigation, but you didn't. You chose comfort over truth. We all did. The room was silent now. So instead of focusing on punishment, Eleanor continued, I propose we focus on remembrance, on making sure Elizabeth's story, James's story, is told and preserved, on teaching the next generation to be braver than we were. A woman in the back stood up. Maya recognized her as Susan Whitmore, James's younger sister, now in her 50s. I agree with Eleanor, Susan said, her voice trembling. I've spent nearly 40 years believing my brother died in a stupid accident, that Elizabeth was somehow responsible. Now I know the truth, and it's devastating. But it's also freeing. For the first time I can grieve properly. I can honor who James really was, A man who stood up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. She walked to the front of the room and extended her hand to Tom. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because I can't carry this hatred anymore. And because I think that's what James would have wanted." Tom took her hand, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." The meeting ended with a vote. Overwhelmingly, the town agreed to establish the Elizabeth Brennan Memorial Fund, dedicated to preserving her cabin, maintaining James Whitmore's legacy, and providing scholarships for students who demonstrated moral courage. Maya was asked to serve on the board. At 11 years old, she was the youngest member by 4 decades. But no one questioned her right to be there. Over the following months, the cabin became a project that unified the town in ways Maya had never imagined. Volunteers hiked up with materials to repair the roof and reinforce the foundation. Eleanor worked with the county to get the site registered as a historical landmark. Susan Whitmore donated money to create interpretive displays about James's life and work. And Maya, she led tours for school groups, telling the story of Elizabeth and James, of truth and courage, of what happens when we choose comfort over justice. Her mother came to one of the tours, hiking up the mountain for the first time. Sarah stood in the cabin doorway, looking at her daughter explaining the significance of the journal entries, the photographs, the evidence. Tears ran down her face. Later, as they hiked down together, Sarah squeezed Maya's hand. "I'm so proud of you, baby. You're stronger than I ever was." "I learned from you, Mama," Maya said. "You taught me to keep going even when things are hard." Sarah pulled her daughter close. For the first time in years, Maya felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The cabin stood through that winter, protected now, maintained, visited. And in the spring, on the anniversary of James Whitmore's death, the town held a memorial service at the site. They unveiled a plaque. "In memory of James Whitmore, who died August 14, 1979, seeking truth and justice, and Elizabeth Brennan, who lived 1951 to 2003, who kept the truth alive when no one else would listen. May their courage inspire us to be better." Maya stood with Eleanor and Susan Whitmore, watching as people filed past, laying flowers, paying respects. The ceremony was simple, quiet, but it meant everything. As the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, Maya walked to the cabin's porch and sat on the steps, just as Elizabeth must have done hundreds of times. She looked out at the mountains, at the town visible far below, at the vast sky overhead. She thought about how she'd felt 6 months ago, invisible, lonely, convinced her life would always be small. And she thought about how wrong she'd been. Finding this cabin hadn't just uncovered a buried truth. It had uncovered Maya herself, had shown her that she was capable of things she'd never imagined, that her voice mattered, that she could make a difference. Eleanor sat down beside her. "What are you thinking about?" "About Elizabeth," Maya said. "About how she waited all those years for someone to believe her. I wish I could have met her, could have told her that her waiting wasn't for nothing." Eleanor put her arm around Maya's shoulders. "I think she knows. Somehow, wherever she is, I think she knows." They sat together as the light faded, 2 people separated by 5 decades but united by purpose, by truth, by the understanding that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones no one else was looking for. And high above them, in a clearing that had held secrets for 37 years, a cabin stood no longer forgotten, no longer unclaimed, but transformed into exactly what Elizabeth had hoped. A testimony to truth, a reminder that courage matters, and a promise that the silenced will eventually be heard if someone is brave enough to listen. The winter snows came early that year, blanketing Pine Ridge in white by mid-November. The cabin, now maintained by the Historical Society, stood sealed against the elements, its monthly checks performed by volunteers who snowshoed up the mountain to ensure the structure remained sound. Maya couldn't make the trip in deep snow, but she thought about it constantly, that place that had changed everything. It was now March of 2024, 5 months since the memorial service, and Pine Ridge had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The Brennan Memorial Fund had raised over $60,000. Tom Harper had donated his entire savings, nearly $45,000, as what he called his penance. The money funded scholarships, historical preservation, and a new community center program teaching local history to elementary students. Maya's life had changed most of all. She was 12 now, no longer the invisible girl from the trailer park. Teachers called on her in class. Students invited her to sit with them at lunch. Her mother had been promoted to shift manager at the diner, a raise that meant they could finally afford to move out of the trailer park and into a small rental house on Maple Street. But the biggest change was internal. Maya walked differently now, stood straighter, spoke with confidence she'd never possessed before. She'd learned that her voice mattered, that asking questions and seeking truth wasn't troublemaking, it was necessary. On a Saturday morning in late March, as the snow began its retreat and the first signs of spring emerged, Maya received a phone call that would open yet another chapter in Elizabeth's story. Eleanor's voice was breathless with excitement. "Maya, you need to come to the library, right now. Someone's here who you need to meet." Maya grabbed her jacket and rode her bike the 12 blocks to the Pine Ridge Public Library, her mind racing with possibilities. When she walked through the doors, Eleanor was standing with a woman Maya had never seen before. She was in her 60s, with grey hair cut short and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Something about her face seemed familiar. "Maya," Eleanor said, "this is Dr. Catherine Brennan, Elizabeth's younger sister." Maya's breath caught. I didn't know she had a sister. "Neither did anyone in Pine Ridge," Catherine said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, warm. "Elizabeth and I had a falling out years before she moved here. We didn't speak for over 2 decades. I didn't even know she'd died until last month when a friend sent me the article about what you discovered." They moved to Eleanor's office and Catherine pulled out a worn leather satchel. "I've spent the last few weeks going through Elizabeth's things, what little remained. The lawyer in Nevada had kept a box for her, things she'd left in storage, and I found something I think you should see." She withdrew a journal, different from the one Maya had found in the cabin. This one was newer, the pages less yellowed. "Elizabeth kept writing," Catherine explained, "even after she left the cabin. This journal covers the years 2000 to 2003, the last years of her life." Maya's hands trembled as she opened it. The entries were shorter now, more reflective. Elizabeth wrote about her life in Nevada, working as a home health aide under an assumed name. She wrote about the mountains she could see from her apartment window, how they reminded her of Colorado but could never replace it. She wrote about forgiveness, about healing, about learning to live with the past. One entry, dated December 25th, 2002, made Maya's eyes fill with tears. "Spent Christmas alone again, but I've made peace with solitude. It's been my companion for so long now, I wouldn't know what to do without it. Sometimes I wonder if anyone in Pine Ridge remembers me. If anyone ever thinks about James and what really happened. I like to imagine that someday someone will find my cabin, someone brave and curious, someone who won't accept easy answers, and they'll tell the story I couldn't tell. They'll give James the honor he deserved and clear my name, even if I'm not there to see it. That hope keeps me going. The thought that truth eventually always finds its way to the light." "She was waiting for you," Catherine said softly. "All those years, she was waiting for someone like you." Maya wiped her eyes. "I wish I'd found it sooner. I wish she could have known." "But that's just it," Catherine said, pulling out another document. "She did know. Not about you specifically, but she knew it would happen. Look at this." It was Elizabeth's will, dated March 2003, just weeks before her death. In it, she left her cabin and all its contents to whoever discovers it and has the courage to tell the truth. She'd also left instructions for her sister, if Catherine could be found, to ensure that person received a letter Elizabeth had written. Catherine handed Maya an envelope. "This is for you." Maya's hands shook as she opened it. The letter was dated April 1st, 2003. "To the person who found my cabin, I don't know who you are or when you'll read this, but I know you're brave. It takes courage to explore the unknown, to ask difficult questions, to pursue truth even when it's uncomfortable. Those are qualities I valued in James, qualities I tried to embody myself, even when it cost me everything. If you're reading this, then my story has finally been told. James's real story has finally been heard. That brings me more peace than you can imagine. For years I carried the weight of knowing the truth and being unable to make anyone listen. It was a special kind of torture, being silenced not by force but by disbelief. I want you to know that your courage means everything, not just to me, but to everyone who's ever been dismissed, doubted, or driven away for speaking uncomfortable truths. You've shown that one person, asking the right questions and refusing to accept easy answers, can change everything. Use my cabin however you think best. Let it stand as a reminder that truth matters more than comfort, that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing, and that the smallest voices sometimes carry the most important messages. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for being brave enough to care. With gratitude and hope, Elizabeth Marie Brennan. Maya couldn't speak. She held the letter against her chest and cried, the kind of crying that releases years of pain and loneliness and fear. Eleanor put her arm around Maya's shoulders while Catherine squeezed her hand. You gave my sister peace, Catherine said. Even though she's gone, you gave her the one thing she wanted most, to be believed, to have her truth acknowledged. That's a gift beyond measure. Over the following weeks, Catherine worked with Eleanor and Maya to establish a more permanent memorial. Using money from Elizabeth's small estate and additional donations from the community, they created the Brennan Whitmore Center for Truth and Justice, housed in a renovated building on Main Street. The center featured a museum about Elizabeth and James's story, a research library focused on historical injustices, and meeting rooms for community dialogues about difficult topics. Maya was appointed as a junior board member, the youngest in the center's history. She helped design exhibits, gave presentations to school groups, and worked with Catherine to process Elizabeth's remaining belongings. One afternoon in late April, while organizing photographs for a new display, Maya found a picture she'd never seen before. It showed Elizabeth as a young girl, maybe 9 or 10, standing with another girl who looked a few years younger. Both were laughing, their arms around each other's shoulders. On the back, someone had written, Elizabeth and Catherine, summer 1964. Maya showed it to Catherine, who was working at the next table. Catherine's face softened as she looked at the image. That was taken at our grandparents' cabin in the mountains. We used to spend every summer there. Elizabeth taught me how to fish, how to identify birds, how to be brave in the wilderness. She paused, emotion thick in her voice. I think that's why she built her cabin in the mountains. It reminded her of when we were close before life got complicated. What happened between you? Maya asked gently. Catherine sighed. I sided with our parents when they told Elizabeth to leave Pine Ridge, to stop fighting, to just accept what people believed and move on. I thought she was being stubborn, making things harder than they needed to be. I was young, stupid, and I chose comfort over supporting my sister. By the time I realized how wrong I'd been, she'd disappeared completely. I looked for her for years, but she didn't want to be found. She would have forgiven you, Maya said. How do you know? Catherine asked. Maya thought about all the journal entries she'd read, about Elizabeth's reflections on forgiveness and healing. Because holding on to anger wasn't who she was. She was hurt, but she wasn't cruel. And she understood that people make mistakes. Catherine pulled Maya into a hug. You're wise beyond your years, you know that? I learned from Elizabeth, Maya said simply. The grand opening of the Brennan Whitmore Center took place on June 15, 2024, chosen because it would have been James Whitmore's 68th birthday. The entire town turned out, along with visitors from across Colorado and beyond. News stations covered the event. A documentary filmmaker asked for permission to make a film about the story. Maya stood at the podium during the opening ceremony, looking out at hundreds of faces. A year ago, speaking in front of even 5 people would have terrified her. Now, she spoke with clarity and purpose. A year ago, I was nobody, she began. I was the poor kid, the quiet kid, the invisible kid. I felt like my life didn't matter, like nothing I did could make a difference. And then I found a cabin in the mountains, and everything changed. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But here's what I've learned. It wasn't finding the cabin that changed me. It was choosing to pay attention, to ask questions, to not accept the easy answers. Elizabeth Brennan lived her entire adult life being ignored, dismissed, and silenced. But she never stopped believing that truth mattered. She kept her evidence, wrote her journals, and waited for someone who would listen. Maya looked at Catherine, seated in the front row with Susan Whitmore beside her. What happened to Elizabeth and James was a tragedy, but what happened after, the silence, the willingness to believe lies because they were more comfortable than truth, that was a choice. A choice this community made for almost 40 years. The crowd was absolutely silent now. But here's the good news. We can make different choices. We can choose to listen to uncomfortable truths. We can choose to believe people who are dismissed and doubted. We can choose courage over comfort. That's what this center represents. Not just remembering the past, but learning from it, being better because of it. She held up the photograph of young Elizabeth and Catherine. This is Elizabeth before tragedy, before betrayal, before exile. Just a girl in the mountains, happy and free. That's who she always was, underneath everything else. And that's who I think we should remember, not just as a victim, but as someone who showed us what real courage looks like. The applause was thunderous. People stood wiping their eyes. Tom Harper, seated near the back, had tears streaming down his weathered face. After the ceremony, as people toured the center and examined the exhibits, Susan Whitmore approached Maya with a small wooden box. "This belonged to James," she said. "I've been holding on to it for years, couldn't bear to look inside, but I think it's time, and I think you should be the one to open it with me." They found a quiet corner, and Susan lifted the lid. Inside were treasures from James's life, his Forest Service badge, photographs of him with Elizabeth, letters they'd written to each other, a small velvet box containing an engagement ring. At the bottom was a leather notebook, James's field journal from the summer of 1979. Susan opened it with trembling hands. The pages detailed his daily work, wildlife observations, trail conditions, and then, starting in early August, entries about the grow operation he'd discovered. August 7th, 1979, found another site today, bigger than the others. At least 200 plants, sophisticated irrigation, armed guards. Took photographs from a distance. This is getting dangerous, but I can't look the other way. These operations are destroying federal land, putting hikers at risk, and corrupting good people. I have to do something. August 10th, showed Deputy Harper my evidence. Hoped he'd help, but he seemed scared. Told me to drop it. Said I didn't understand what I was getting into. But I do understand. If good people stay silent when they witness wrongdoing, then good people become part of the wrong. Elizabeth says I'm being reckless, but she also says she's proud of me. That's all that matters. August 13th. Tomorrow, I'm hiking back to the main site. Want to get one more set of photographs before I submit everything to the FBI on Monday. Elizabeth wanted to come, but I told her it's too dangerous. If anything happens to me, she has copies of all my evidence. She'll know what to do with it. The final entry was dated August 14th, 1979, the day James died. Early morning, heading out. Sky is beautiful, clear and blue. Going to be a good day for photography. Elizabeth kissed me goodbye this morning, made me promise to be careful. I promised. After this is over, after the FBI handles it, we're getting married and leaving Pine Ridge. Going somewhere we can start fresh, maybe Montana or Oregon. Somewhere with mountains and clean air and no secrets buried in the forest. Can't wait for that life to begin. Susan closed the journal, sobbing quietly. Maya put her arm around the older woman, and they sat together in shared grief for the life James never got to live, for the future he and Elizabeth had planned and lost. "They should have grown old together," Susan whispered. "They should have had children, grandchildren, a lifetime of ordinary happiness." They should have, Maya agreed. And what happened to them was wrong, but we're making sure their story matters, that their lives counted for something. Susan looked at Maya with red-rimmed eyes. You know what I think? I think James and Elizabeth would have loved you. You're exactly the kind of person they were, brave, honest, unwilling to accept injustice. They'd be so proud. As the sun set on the opening day of the Brennan Whitmore Center, Maya stood outside watching the last visitors leave. Eleanor joined her, both of them quiet in the fading light. You did something remarkable, Maya, Eleanor said. You changed this town. We did it together, Maya replied. You, me, Catherine, Susan, even Tom in his own way. Elizabeth and James started it. We just finished what they began. Do you think they'd be satisfied? Eleanor asked. With what we've created? Maya thought about Elizabeth's letter, about James's final journal entry, about all the evidence carefully preserved in that cabin for decades. I think they'd be relieved. Not just that the truth came out, but that it led to something positive, that their tragedy became a catalyst for change. The following school year, Maya started 7th grade at Pine Ridge Middle School. She was no longer the quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She joined the debate team, became editor of the school newspaper, and started a club focused on local history and social justice. Her mother, now thriving in her management position, enrolled in community college classes, working toward a business degree. They moved again, this time into a small house they were buying, not renting. It had a real yard, a front porch, and bedrooms with doors that closed. On Maya's bedroom wall hung the photograph of Elizabeth standing in front of her cabin, smiling at the future she couldn't have known would hold so much pain, but also, eventually, so much redemption. Years would pass. Maya would graduate high school, attend college on a Brennan Memorial Scholarship, and eventually return to Pine Ridge to work at the center that had started with her discovery. The cabin would be visited by thousands, its story told and retold, inspiring others to speak truth and seek justice. But the real legacy wasn't in buildings or scholarships or museums. It was in the shift that had occurred in one small mountain town, the understanding that silence protects the guilty and courage honors the truth. It was in the lives changed by one 11-year-old girl who refused to accept that an abandoned cabin was just an abandoned cabin, who understood that every hidden place holds a story worth telling. Anyone can change the world if they're curious enough to explore what others ignore, brave enough to speak what others silence, and stubborn enough to believe that truth, no matter how long buried, deserves to be unearthed. As Maya Chen grew from girl to woman, as Pine Ridge evolved from a town of buried secrets to a community of acknowledged truths, the cabin stood in its clearing, maintained and protected, a monument to the power of listening, to the importance of believing those who have been dismissed, to the courage it takes to say, this isn't right, and the strength required to make it right. Elizabeth Brennan had waited decades for someone to hear her. James Whitmore had died trying to expose corruption, and Maya, a lonely child seeking escape in the mountains, had become the voice they both needed, the bridge between their silenced truth and the world's eventual understanding. The cabin was never truly abandoned. It was waiting, and when the right person finally came along, someone with eyes to see and ears to hear and a heart brave enough to care, it gave up its secrets and changed everything. Because that's what truth does. If you give it time and someone willing to listen, it breaks through, it transforms, it heals. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it begins with a single step into the unknown, taken by someone the world had taught to be invisible, who discovered she'd been visible all along. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories of courage, discovery, and the power of one person to make a difference. Click to continue your journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that every hidden truth deserves to be brought into the light.